welcome to First Luke, a Bible study looking ahead to the readings for the coming Sunday, in this case the fourth Sunday of Advent. As for the last few weeks, we've got two readings we're considering this week, but before we dive into those, if you've not done so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this Bible study. You can find the link for it just below the video in YouTube if you're watching it back on that platform. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into the first of our two readings, which is from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 to 7. This reading is very much part of the corpus of 1st Isaiah, which runs from chapters 1 to 39 of that book, and it covers a very particular historical period, beginning in the year 742 BCE, and continuing through to probably about the year 689, something like that. At that time, Assyria was the dominant power in the region, and from the year 735 to about 732, Israel in the north and Aram, modern-day Syria, were attacking Judah in the south. And Isaiah had advised the king of Judah, King Ahaz, to turn to God for protection and not to seek help from Assyria. So that's part of the backdrop. And then jumping forward a little bit to the years 705 to 701 BCE, Isaiah opposed King Hezekiah's attempted rebellion against Assyria, which led to the siege of Jerusalem. But actually that didn't end up resulting in the destruction of the city or the temple, and that convinced Isaiah that God would indeed protect Jerusalem and protect the temple. Out of that period we get the great messianic hymns, which include the first few verses of chapter 9, and also the first 9 verses of chapter 11. So the hope that gives rise to that was born during that period. Now, in its original context, this passage from Isaiah 9 may relate to the coronation of King Hezekiah, who ruled from 715 to 687 BCE. But as we'll see, there might be a broader canvas on which this is being painted. And it's usually been read by Christians as relating to Jesus, so there's been that later Christian interpretation of this text. So key themes within 1st Isaiah are God's exercising universal dominion over creation from Jerusalem, and divine favour being enjoyed by both the city and its monarchy. And for the author, there was a firm belief that neither Jerusalem nor the Davidic monarchy would ever fall. As we know, things didn't work out like that, but that was very much what they believed and hoped. Note that this is part of a kind of subunit of 1st Isaiah that runs from chapters 1 to 12, though debates continue to rage about the unity of 1st Isaiah and how many different authors we actually have at work. When we dive into the actual passage itself, immediately we come across a complex textual issue, and it's to do with what the NRSV calls chapter 9 verse 1. There are differences between the Hebrew and the Greek versions of Isaiah. So in the Hebrew version, what's known as the MT, what the NRSV designates as chapter 9 verse 1 is bolted onto the end of chapter 8 instead. And that means that today's oracle is the beginning of chapter 9, and it's something new in its own right. However, in the Greek version, what's known as the Septuagint, or the LXX, the verse that's now chapter 9 verse 1 is seen to introduce today's oracle, so it kind of sets the backdrop for it. So there's a difference of interpretation there. And it really relates to how much the historical context of all of this sets the scene for the oracle that follows. So if we take it as read that chapter 9 verse 1 is correctly designated, The Assyrian conquest is what forms the backdrop to a movement from doom and gloom in Isaiah 8 to something more hopeful emerging in Isaiah 9, as we find here. Now, Zebulun and Naphtali were conquered by the Assyrian king around 733 to 732 BCE. And the Way of the Sea relates to the coastal area just south of Mount Carmel, and the land beyond the Jordan to the region east of Galilee. And it's hoped that these lands might be recovered under the rule of King Hezekiah, who was fairly newly coming to the throne of Israel, and certainly that appears to have been Isaiah's hope. The shift that we find from darkness to light in verses 2 to 3 is explained by what then follows, about the yoke of slavery having been broken, about the weapons of battle having been removed, and about a child having been born. Now, the identity of the child in verse 5 is unknown, but there are two ways of reading it. One is to say that this is hyperbole, and that actually it relates to the coronation of King Hezekiah. And the thing that backs that up is that the language in verses 6 to 7 is very similar to what you get in the equivalent kinds of liturgies in Egypt coming from that period. But there are those that argue that it makes sense to see this, instead of in a particular historical setting, in terms of its canonical meaning, in terms of looking at it in the context of Isaiah as a whole. And in that sense, it makes more meaning to say this relates to the coming Messiah, Emmanuel, God with us. And we see a point towards that in verse 14 of chapter 7, rather, moving towards its culmination with the prophecy in Isaiah 11. So there is a question, I suppose, as to whether we're talking about a very specific historical situation or whether we're looking at a much bigger canvas on which this reading is being painted. And we know in later Christian traditions, say this child being born has been understood to relate to Jesus. So that gives us a sense of where this Isaiah reading is coming from and how it fits into our ongoing story. We come to think about the birth of the child that may be potentially being pointed to by Isaiah in our New Testament reading, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. So the setting for the encounter between Mary and the angel Gabriel is Nazareth. Nazareth at that time was a very small town, had a population, according to Paul Gooder, of about 450 people at the most. It was a bit of a backwater in Galilee. It wasn't a particularly exciting place. It's helpful to note, as we think about this, that marriage was a two-stage process back in the day. So what would happen is that the couple would be betrothed, and at that point the marriage contract would be put together and money would be exchanged. And then a year later, the bride would leave the home of her father and formally marry and move in with her husband. And it was after that point at which a sexual relationship would begin to take place. And we're quite possibly talking about a very young woman in this situation. Luke uses the word parthamos to describe Mary, and that means a young woman of marriageable age who was not yet married. Under Roman law, the minimum age of the groom was 14, but the bride could be as young as 12. And it was legal under Jewish law for the bride to be able to be betrothed from as young as 10. So what we have here is both something that challenges the translation of betrothal as engagement, because what we mean by engagement in a modern context is much less significant than what betrothal meant back then. Betrothal was legally binding. But also it's a passage that challenges our notions about childhood and when that ends and when adulthood might begin. In terms of the key figures in this passage, we have obviously the angel Gabriel. He appears in both Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 and helps Daniel understand his visions. He's a messenger, And he tends to pop up when there's going to be some sort of disruption, some sort of change within Israel's national situation. We have, albeit somewhat in the background, Joseph. He was descended from the line of King David, and we know from later passages that he was probably a carpenter. So we know that Joseph was of royal blood, in other words, and that one of the descendants of King David would be the Messiah, the longed-for Holy One of Israel. And finally we have Mary, who, as I say, was a young woman, probably aged about 12 or 13 at the most, and from the backwater that was Nazareth. We know that Luke's Gospel was the third to be written. Mark was first, then Matthew, then we have Luke. And Luke seems to have a particular interest in issues of, I suppose we might say, equality nowadays. But I think particularly Luke is interested in the stories of women and bringing those to the forefront. And it's interesting that Matthew's Gospel tells us the story of Joseph, whereas Luke very much tells us the story of Mary. The Old Testament backdrop to this story is arguably the birth of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 1, not least because Mary's Magnificat, which she will go on to sing, relates very much to the song of Hannah, who was Samuel's mum and who sang her song in thanks for the gift of the child. And there's also something about a relationship between the fulfillment of the prophecies of Nathan to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and what we find today in terms of David's descendants. Note that Gabriel's announcement to Zechariah a few verses ago in verses 8 to 20 of the chapter comes before that of Mary, and yet John the Baptist's birth comes after. So it's kind of like this encounter with the angel Gabriel with Mary is bookended by the story of Zechariah, Elizabeth and John the Baptist. So I think you get very much a sense from Luke of how the events around Zechariah and the birth of John were the forerunning things to the birth of Jesus. And that is again how it will play out later on in adult life. John the Baptist was the forerunner to Jesus, as we've been thinking about in previous weeks. When in verse 26 it refers to the 6th month, therefore it means the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy. So that gives us a sense of the timing is being defined by what happened to Elizabeth. Mary, in verses 27 and 34, is unambiguous about her status. Say Parthamos meant a young woman of marriageable age not yet married, and in that historical context almost certainly did mean a virgin. And Luke just has Mary spell this directly out. There isn't the dependency on a verse from Isaiah that may or may not have been mistranslated that we find in Matthew's Gospel. It's clear Mary and Joseph have not yet slept together. We think of this encounter very much as often happening in a house. But actually, when it uses the language, say the angel Gabriel came into, the Greek is best translated in verse 28, it could be coming into a cave. And it's significant that quite a few people did live in caves in Nazareth. So it could well be this encounter happened in a very different situation to the one we're used to picturing from nativity plays. There's a bit of controversy about how we best translate the angel's greeting to Mary in verse 28. The beginning of it might be translated as rejoice, which isn't controversial. But the second part of it could, depending on whether we look at the Greek or Latin translations, either imply that God is bestowing grace upon Mary or that Mary already had that grace. So the first one would be from the Greek, the second from the Latin. And in the Hail Mary, the blessed art thou among women, that comes from the Latin translation of this verse. We can't blame her in verse 29 for being perplexed by this greeting, though apparently the Greek would be better translated terrified rather than perplexed. You can't blame her for that either. And Luke gives a very political meaning to the whole business. And that's partly because we're told the child will be the Messiah and claim the throne of David. So there's something about the politics of Israel there. But also we're told that this child is going to be the Son of God. And that's a title that Caesar claimed for himself. So there's something here already about the point being made that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, even before he's even been conceived. The role of the Holy Spirit and the overshadowing of the Most High point to this being very much the work of God. And there's no sense here of the angel acting against Mary's will. It is very much based on Mary saying, let this happen according to your will. In other words, despite the controversy some people have tried to whip up around this, I would argue very much that Mary definitely says yes to what the angel is asking of her. And these things of Jesus' kingship and messiahship will continue to be developed throughout Luke's gospel.